The pigs went first, and the town remembered it wrong. For the rest of their lives, they said she must have known. They said, no one buys 34 dying animals for $15. Unless she had already seen the water underneath. Unless she had walked that dead quarter section in the dark and put her ear to the clay and heard it moving. But she had not. She had knelt in the dust of the Hartley auction pen with her hand flat on a sow's heaving side, feeling the ribs come up like fence rails under the skin, and she had thought only one thing, which was that these animals would die by Sunday if nobody took them, and she was the only body left standing at the rail who had not already turned away. That is the whole of what she knew that morning. Everything else the town invented later, because it is easier to believe a woman is cunning than to admit you were wrong to laugh at her. 2 summers earlier, Sarah Voss had been nothing to anyone in Cottonwood County, Kansas, which suited her, because she had come there to be nothing and to be left alone about it. She was 26 years old, and she had buried a husband to fever in the 2nd year of their marriage, and she had taken the little he left, a wagon, a plow, $240 in a coffee tin, and driven west to the one thing she could afford, which was land that no one else wanted. A quarter section on the far side of Dry Creek, up against the chalk bluffs. 160 acres of it, and every acre of it hard. The man who sold it to her had a face that could not hold still while he did it. He kept looking at the door. He told her the creek ran most years, which was a way of saying it did not run this year, and he told her the soil was strong under the top, which was a way of saying the top was nothing but caliche and cracked clay pale as old bone. She paid him $110 for it and shook his hand, and watched relief go across him like weather. She was left with $130 in the tin, and a place the whole county called the Bone 40, though it was $160, because in that country, a thing's true measure was never what you were told. The town of Ledger sat 6 miles east of her line. A single street of frame buildings leaned against the wind, and Ledger took her measure inside a week. A widow, young, alone, on the worst ground in the county. It was a story they already knew the ending of, and they told it to her face with the particular kindness of people who have decided you will fail, and want to be gentle about it beforehand. At the mercantile, Del Corliss, who kept the ledgers the town was named for, weighed out her flour and told her, not unkindly, that she'd have done better to spend her money on a train ticket back to wherever she'd come from. A man could not make that ground pay, he said, and a woman alone surely could not. There was no cruelty in it. That was the thing that wore on her most. They did not hate her. They pitied her, which is heavier to carry, and they said their pity out loud in the street as though she were not standing in it, hearing every word. She learned that country the only way it can be learned, which is by rising before the light and working until her hands went rough as bark, and then working past that, she grubbed sagebrush from the bottoms. She turned what soil would turn, and planted corn that came up pale and thin, and gave up by July. She learned the creek did not run at all, that it was a bed of white stones and a memory, and that the well, the seller had bragged of, gave a bucket of gyp water so bitter the horse would not drink it. She counted her money in the dark, which became a habit that never left her, the arithmetic of a person alone, done by feel because a lamp cost oil. 130 had become 90. 90 became 61. She would lie on the rope bed in the soddy she had cut from her own hillside, and she would count it forward against the seasons. And the sums never came out kind. And still, she did not let herself despair, because despair was a thing you spent and got nothing back for. Instead, she adjusted. She would find another way. She always found another way. Or, she found the edge of one and worked toward it. The old man came to her in the 2nd spring, driving a mule so ancient, it seemed a courtesy to call it living. His name was Anton Kessler, and he had a farm 2 miles south, a place that was green in patches where everyone else's had gone brown, and the town did not laugh at him because he had been there 30 years and had outlasted their laughing. He was from the old country Bavaria, and his English came slow and shaped strange, and he looked at her cracked field and her pale corn a long while before he spoke. Land is not good or bad, he told her finally. Land is only itself. A man calls it bad because he asks it the wrong question. He asked the ground for wheat, and the ground had no wheat to give. Maybe it has something else. Maybe you have not learned yet what to ask. Then he unloaded a sack of seed potatoes from the mule's back, said they would take the dry better than corn, and drove off before she could find the words to thank him. She planted them along the bottom where the caliche broke, and they lived, and in the fall they fed her, and she understood that the old man had told her the only true thing anyone in that county had ever said to her. It was the drought that made everything after. It did not come all at once. It came the way real ruin comes, slow enough that everyone kept believing it would break. The winter had given no snow to speak of. The spring rains that should have come in April held off through May, and by June, the sky over Cottonwood County was a hard, flat blue that never once softened toward gray. Anton stood in her yard one evening and looked up at that too clear sky and did not like it. "The clouds do not come from the west anymore," he said. "Watch the creeks. When the low water goes, that tells you." And the low water was already going. Where a green pool had held in the shade of the bluffs through every summer since anyone could remember, there was now a ring of dried mud, cracked into curling plates, and at its center, a coin of water, no bigger than a wagon wheel, going smaller every day. That was the summer the Hartley auction happened, and that was the summer Sarah Voss walked to Ledger with $2 and came home with 34 dying pigs and 2 cents. Old Hartley had run hogs on the good bottom land east of town, and Old Hartley had died in May, and his sons had come from Kansas City to sell off what was left and get back to their offices, but the drought had already begun its work. The corn that should have fattened those hogs stood stunted in the field, and there was no grass. And the sons had no intention of buying feed for animals they meant to be rid of. So the hogs had starved through June in a dry lot, and by the July auction, they were not hogs anymore so much as the frames of hogs. Gaunt sows, with their hip bones standing out and their eyes gone dull, and no buyer at that rail would give a serious bid for animals that looked 3 days from the rendering pit. The sons grew angry, the auctioneer grew hoarse, and at last, out of pure disgust and the desire to be done, they threw the whole lot of 34 sows into one call and asked who would take them and be shut of it. $15, the auctioneer said, half a joke, 15 for the lot. And in the silence, Sarah Voss put up her hand. The rail turned to look at her the way a room turns to look at a person who has laughed at a funeral. Del Corliss was there, and the Pruitt brothers who farmed the section next to Hartley's and half of Ledger besides, and every one of them found it the finest entertainment of a bad summer. The widow. The bone 40. $15 she did not have for 34 animals that would be dead by August, driving them home to die on the one piece of ground where nothing lived. She heard the laughing start behind her, and she did not turn around. She counted out what she had. She had brought $2, and Anton, who was there and who had said nothing and offered nothing, before her hand went up, quietly put 13 more into the auctioneer's palm without a word, so the 15 came whole, and without meeting her eye, so that she would not be shamed by falling short. She would pay him back, she told him low. Pay the pigs back. He said, it is their debt now, not yours. And she took her paper and went to open the pen. Driving 34 weak sows 6 miles is not a thing that photographs like a triumph. It took her most of 2 days. They went slow and some went down, and she got them up with water, carried in a bucket, and patience carried from somewhere she did not know she had. She lost none of them on the road, which was the first small victory, and she did not tell it to a soul, because she had already begun the habit that would carry her through everything after, the habit of banking her success low and quiet, like a coal under ash, letting no one see it flare until she was ready. She got them onto the bone 40 in the last light of the second day, and turned them loose into the dry bottom by the dead creek, where there was nothing but cracked clay and the pale ghosts of grass, and she leaned on the fence, too tired to feel anything at all, and watched 34 starving animals begin out of some instinct older than the drought. To root. Now understand what rooting is, for it is the whole hinge of this story. A hog does not graze like a cow, taking what is offered on top. A hog drives its snout down into the earth, and turns it, works it, tears it open, looking for what is beneath. roots and grubs and the cool dark of the underground, which is where a hog wants to be when the sun is a hammer. And these 34, starved to the edge of dying, went at that dead ground with a desperation that was almost terrible to watch. They rooted the bottom of that creek bed for 3 days, spreading and tearing, following something, and Sarah did not yet know what, until the 4th morning she came down at first light and found the low corner of the bottom, the deepest cup of it against the base of the bluff, gone dark. Not with shade, with wet. The clay there was black and slick, and the pigs were wallowing in it, coating themselves in cool mud, and where they had rooted deepest a seep of clear water was standing in the churned holes, welling up faint but steady from below. She stood a long while and did not let herself believe it. She had learned that country's cruelty too well to believe a kindness on sight. She went back at noon, when the sun would have burned off any surface damp, and the wet was still there, and more of it. She dug with a spade where the pigs had opened the ground, and 2 feet down the clay turned to a stratum of gravel, and out of the gravel the water came, cold, so cold it ached her wrist, and clean, with none of the jip bitterness of the well. She tasted it off her hand, and it was sweet. And she understood, kneeling in the churned mud, with the pigs grunting around her, and the dead creek stretching white and useless in both directions, what the seller had half known and lied about, and what Anton had told her in his gnomic way, and what the whole county had been too proud to imagine. There was water under the Bone 40. There had always been water under it. A buried spring, sealed over by years of hard pan and silt, so that not a drop reached the surface, running cold and steady in its gravel bed far below the reach of any drought, because the drought was a thing of the sky, and this water had never once belonged to the sky. It ran from the chalk bluffs, from rain that had fallen years before and sunk and traveled slow through stone, and 34 dying animals, asking the ground the only question they knew how to ask, had torn open the door to it. She told Anton first, because Anton was the only one she trusted with a thing so fragile. He came and knelt where she knelt and put his old hand into the cold seep and was quiet for a long time, and then he said, in that shaped, slow English, that he had wondered, 30 years, he had wondered why the bluffs stayed green in their seams when all else browned, and now he knew. "This is a spring," he said. "This is a spring that forgot how to reach the top, and your pigs remembered it for it." He looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen from any person in that county, which was respect, without pity underneath it. "You must not tell them," he said. "Not yet. A green field in a dry summer is a thing men take from a woman alone, if she is not ready. Dig it first. Make it yours in the ground before it is yours in their mouths." So she dug. She dug through the rest of that July with the pigs as her only company and her partners besides, for where she wanted the water, they had already loosened the way. She sank a proper hole at the deep cup, cribbed it with cottonwood she cut and hauled from the one living stand 2 miles off, and the water rose in it and held at a level that did not fall, no matter how she drew from it. It was not a flood, it was better than a flood, because it was steady, a spring that gave and did not care what the sky did. She ran a shallow ditch by hand out along the bottom, and where the water went, the ground answered so fast it frightened her, green coming up out of what had been bone in a matter of days, because the seed had always been there in the soil waiting only for the one thing it lacked. And the pigs, on green and on water, and on the grubs that came alive in the wet ground, began to change. The frames of them filled. The dull went out of their eyes. By the end of that month, the 34 sows that Ledger had watched her drive off to die were rounding out, glossy, rooting, and wallowing, and thriving on the only green land for miles in every direction. And no one in the county knew a thing about it, because between the bluffs and the fold of her land the Bone 40 could not be seen from any road. And she kept it that way on purpose, banking her coal low. Under the ash hunger changes a town, and by August the town was hungry. The drought had done to everyone what it had begun to do the summer she bought the land, only now there was no more believing it would break. The Pruitt brothers' corn burned in the row. Del Corliss's ledgers, filled with debts, no one could pay because there was no crop to pay them with. The good bottom land east of Ledger, the land everyone had wanted, cracked and blue. Wells went bitter or went dry. The little water that was left, men hauled in barrels for miles and rationed by the cup, and the arithmetic that Sarah Voss had done alone in the dark for 2 years was now being done in the dark by every family in the county, and the sums came out cruel for all of them. Cattle went down in the fields. And the very men who had leaned on the auction rail and laughed at the widow and her dying pigs now watched their own good animals sink to the frames of animals and did not laugh at anything anymore. It was a man named Hollis Rourke who found her out, and it was no accident that it was him. Rourke was a stock buyer out of the railhead at Abilene, a smooth, heavy man who wore a town coat in the country and had made his money for 20 years by arriving where things were worst and buying them for less than they were worth. He drove the county in a dust-colored buggy that summer, and he bought dying cattle for $1 a head from men too broken to refuse, and he knew, the way that kind of man always knows, that ruin is a harvest if you have cash in your pocket when everyone else has none. He was looking for more of the same when he came up the wrong track, past the chalk bluffs, and rounded the fold of the land and saw, where the map and the county's whole opinion said there should be nothing but bone, a green bottom, and a running ditch, and 34 fat sows in the shade of the cottonwoods. He stopped his buggy. He sat there a long time. Then he took off his hat and fanned himself and began, in his own mind, the arithmetic of a man who has just found something he intends to take. He was all warmth when he came to her door. He praised the pigs. He praised her sense, said he'd heard there was a clever young widow out this way, but hadn't believed the half of it, and now here was the proof. He talked around it and around it in the way of a man laying a rope out slow so the animal won't shy. And then he came to it. Times being what they were, he said, a place like this, the water especially, oh, he'd seen the water. A place like this was a temptation to hard men, and a woman alone, so far from town, could not always be safe with such a thing. He would take it off her hands, land and pigs, and spring, the whole of it, and he named a figure, $300, and he said it the way a man says a great generosity, watching her face for the gratitude. $300, when the water alone was worth the county. She was quiet. She had learned in 2 years that stillness unsettles a certain kind of man more than any argument, and she let the stillness sit. Then, she asked him plainly how he had come to know about the spring, when she had shown it to no one and it could not be seen from any road, and had he perhaps ridden onto her land without her leave? And she watched the warmth stutter on his face, watched him reach for an answer and find the wrong one. And she knew, and he knew, she knew, that he had trespassed to find it, and that his $300 was not a rescue, but a robbery he'd hoped she was too green to see. He left angry. Angry men do damage, and she knew that too, and she did not sleep well after. But Rourke's greed did a thing he did not intend, which was to tell her the true worth of what she had, and to tell her that the time of banking it low under the ash was over. If a buyer would trespass and lie for the water, then the water was the answer to the whole county's summer, and a hidden green field in a dying land could not stay hidden much longer, and when it came out, it would be safer to have chosen how it came out than to have it torn from her. She went to Anton and told him about Rourke, and the old man was quiet a long time, and then he said the thing that turned the story. You have been keeping it, he said, because you were afraid they would take it. But you can give it before they can take it. A thing given is a thing no man can steal. Feed them, and it is yours forever. Sell it to Rourke, and it is his by morning. She sat with that a long while in the dark, doing a different arithmetic than she had ever done, and in the morning she hitched the wagon and drove to Ledger. She went to Del Corliss's mercantile, where the town gathered because there was nowhere else, and where the same men who had laughed at the rail now stood around with the beaten look of people watching their livelihoods die by inches. She stood in the door until they noticed her, and then she said what she had come to say. Plainly, without heat and without triumph, though God knew she had earned the right to both. She had water, she said. A spring on her land that the drought had not touched, and would not touch, cold, and steady, and sweet. She had more of it than she could ever use, and any man in the county who had stock dying of thirst could bring them to the Bone 40 and water them free, and any family that needed drinking water could fill their barrels there and welcome, and she would take nothing for it. Not now, not while it was needed. There was a silence in that store you could have leaned against. Someone laughed, the way men laugh when they are afraid to believe a thing, and it died fast because no one joined it. Del Corliss set down his pencil, and one of the Pruitt brothers, the younger one, whose face she remembered from the auction rail, said in a voice gone strange, "The Bone 40. And she said it was never the Bone 40. It was only 160 acres, asking the wrong question, and I finally learned the right one. They did not believe it until they saw it, and then they could not stop seeing it. They came the next morning, wary, half-shamed, driving their sunk cattle up the wrong track past the chalk bluffs, and they rounded the fold of the land and stopped their wagons exactly where Rourke had stopped his, and they took off their hats. The green of it, the running ditch, the full cold well, and the 34 fat sows in the shade. Men who had leaned on the auction rail and told a widow she'd have done better to buy a train ticket, now stood in her yard with their eyes wet and did not know where to put their hands. They watered their dying cattle at her spring, and the cattle drank as though drinking were a new invention, and the water did not fall, gave and gave the way it had always given, indifferent to the ruin overhead. Families came with their barrels. The children she had watched grow thin came and drank sweet water from her ladle, and Sarah Voss, who had counted her arithmetic alone in the dark for 2 years, while a whole town pitied her, stood in the middle of all of it, and took no money and said, "No, I told you so," because Anton had taught her the last thing, which was that being right is its own kind of reply and does not need to be spoken. Hollis Rourke did not fare so well. He had one more move in him, and it was the move of his kind, which was the law. He came back with a paper and a lawyer's word, claiming there was a question about her title that the seller 2 years gone had never properly filed, that a place bought so cheap by a woman alone might not be hers to give away at all. He said it loud in front of the men watering their cattle, meaning to shame her and frighten them off. But he had misjudged the town. He'd spent all summer bleeding. Del Corliss, who kept the ledgers the town was named for and had recorded her purchase himself 2 years before, went into his mercantile and came back with his book and laid it open in the dust of her yard and read out the entry, the date, the sum, $110 paid and witnessed, the section and the range. Broad, piled proper and paid, in full. And the papers Rourke was holding, scattered across the grass like startled birds when the younger Pruitt took them from his hand. And the men Rourke had bought dying cattle from all summer for $1 a head stood around him in a ring. And it is a hard thing to run a swindle on people who have just been given water for nothing by the woman you meant to rob. Rourke got back in his dust-colored buggy. No one helped him turn it around. He drove off down the wrong track and out of the county and out of this story, ruined by nothing more than his own greed meeting. At last, a people who had remembered how to be a town. The rain came in September, as rain always finally does, and it broke the drought and greened the county, and men who had watered their cattle at her spring took them home fat where they should have been bones, and the corn came the next year, and Cottonwood County went on. But it did not forget, and it did not tell the story right, because the story it wanted to tell was that the clever widow had known about the water all along, had schemed her way to the one green acre in a dying land. That was easier to hold than the truth. The truth was harder and better. The truth was that a woman with 2 cents and 160 acres of scorn had knelt at an auction rail and been unable to walk away from 34 dying animals, and that Mercy, not cunning, had bought that land, and that the animals themselves, asking the only question they knew, had answered a question the whole county was too proud to ask. She married no man and needed none. She ran her hogs and her spring and hired the younger Pruitt boy when he came asking to learn, and she taught him the way Anton had taught her. That land is not good or bad, that it is only itself, and that a thing is only ever worth what you are willing to see in it. Anton Kessler lived 4 more years and spent a great many of his evenings on her porch, and near the end of them, he told her that he had put those $13 into the auctioneer's hand that day, not out of pity, but because he had watched her 2 years and known that whatever she took hold of, she would not let die. And he had wanted to see what she would do with a thing everyone else had given up on. And Sarah, who by then had a name in the county and a green place where they'd all sworn nothing could grow, told him he had seen right. When he passed, she buried him, looking out over the bottom where the water ran, and she planted cottonwoods along the ditch so there would always be shade for the animals. And on the hot afternoons, the fat descendants of 34 starving sows would gather there to root and wallow in the cool black mud. Over the door they had torn open, above the spring that the drought had never reached and never would, because it had never once belonged to the sky. She had paid $15 for them, or 2 cents and an old man's faith depending on how you counted. And it was the best money, she would say to the Pruitt boy when he was a man himself and running his own good ground, that anyone in that whole county ever spent. Land is only itself, she would tell him, the way it had been told to her. You have only to learn the right question. And then, because it was true, and because the pigs were dozing in the shade of her spring, while the wide dry country stretched pale in every direction beyond her green fold of it, she would say the rest of it, the part that was hers and not Anton's. The part that was the whole of what 2 years alone in the dark had taught her, that the world is full of things called worthless by people who never troubled to look, and that everything worth having, she had found, comes first disguised as something no one else will take.